So in a second chat, we're going to have on a guest who works with Cuban doctors. And I wanted to show you a quick little thing before we dive into it. Michael Moore's documentary, Sicko.
The worst place on earth. The most evil nation ever created. How do we know that? Because that's what we've been told for over 45 years. In the U.S., healthcare costs run nearly $7,000 per person. But in Cuba, they spend only $251. And yet, the Cubans are able to have a lower infant mortality rate than the United States, a longer average lifespan than the United States. They believe in preventive medicine. And it seems like there's a doctor on every block.
No! Hey, how's it going? So for folks who do not know, folks, this is Danny Valdes, New Yorker by way of Miami, Cubano-American, dad, eco-socialist, co-chair of DSA Cuba, organizer with the New York City DSA, Groundwork DSA, and founder of Comrades with Kids, on to talk about his work with Cuban doctors.
Not explicitly Cuban doctors, but of course, Cuban medicine is kind of like one of the hallmarks of what the Cuban Revolution has been able to achieve. Mm-hmm. And so it always becomes part of the conversation. And, you know, there's been a lot of news recently about specifically Cuban medical missions. Which is a huge part of how Cuba does diplomacy, and the way that they do that is they send their doctors to places that are in need, and these doctors go on these missions for years at a time. They're in places that have very little or no medical infrastructure really, or in the wake of some kind of humanitarian disaster or natural disaster where, you know, medical staff are needed, including, by the way, Cuba offered to send doctors here right after 9/11, and the Cuban and the American government refused for that to happen. Even willing to send doctors to a country that, you know, has actively had its boot on Cuba's throat for decades, and that just goes, I think, to the point that, you know, Cuba does this really from a solidaristic and humanitarian point of view.
We did just watch a clip of Michael Moore's 2007 documentary Sicko, and he raised a good question. How do they do it? Is it Satanism? Is it communist propaganda? What is it exactly? I joke, but oftentimes whenever I bring up Cuba, I play a classic Michael Parenti clip where he talks about how before the institution of Cuban healthcare came about, you'd have to carry someone across mountains in the Escambray, and now it's doctors going everywhere. You go out into the countryside, abroad, and that's your service to the people. So maybe a good place to start is by going back to the inception of Cuban healthcare and you know what it looked like before, so we can look at what it is now.
Yeah, and I would, you know, the Cuban Revolution in general, especially in its early years, was really about uplifting Cuba's rural and like ex-urban community. And like you're saying, in a lot of these places, there was no electricity, there were no roads that were any good. People didn't know how to read or write, and that was also a huge effort to increase the literacy rate in rural communities. And that was one of the first things that was taken on by the Federation of Cuban Women as one of their first projects, to send teachers out into the countryside and teach people how to read and write. And it was a hugely successful project. But really, like, it makes me even more angry at our situation in the United States, because it really is just about the political will to do so.
Right.
Right. We're talking about a country that by any measure economically is not doing that well. There are reasons for that, you know, are outside of what the country is able to control. But even still, they managed to guarantee healthcare to every single person in Cuba, and it is a fascinating case study in the perspective and the goals of a government, and when they want to do something for the betterment of their people.
I think I'm looking at the stats here. It's Cuba, as of a 2021 survey, 9.4 doctors per 1,000 people, while America 3.13 doctors per 1,000 people. I mean, is it
it's
a laudable position? Why is that number so high?
well, one, I think it's medical school doesn't cost any money.
Sure.
If you're a doctor in Cuba, you work for the government, you get the government salary, which is not a lot of money. So it's not like doctors in Cuba happens here are making kind of hand over fist over everybody else. People see it as a vocation. They see it as public service. And it's interesting the way the Cuban health system actually works. It's like a 3-tiered system. The first, or like a 3-level system. The first one is what they call the polyclinic, which are small clinics that are in basically every neighborhood in Cuba. And that is kind of like, I think they say that 80% of anything medical that happens in Cuba happens at that level. So that's where you get your basic care, your primary care, your preventative care. If you have an issue that doesn't require hospitalization, think of it as like the urgent cares that we pay through the nose here do. Except the doctors who work there are members of the community. You see them in the grocery stores, you see them at the cafes, you see them at all the different places, which kind of provides an elevated level of care if you need something that can't be done at the polyclinic level. And then the third level is what they call the institutional hospital level, which is where they do research and a lot of research and development. For example, when Cuba had to develop their own COVID vaccines, that would be the level that starts at. And you can enter the system at any level. You can go to a level 3 hospital, and they will take care of you there. But if you're nearer to a polyclinic, you can enter the system.
There's no demand for initial care from the polyclinic?
There's no referrals. There's no pre-existing conditions. There's no any of that. I mean, the goal of the system is to provide health care. That's it. Not to make.
Sounds
profit.
like the people who are, going into these fields want to be doctors. That
Yes.
sounds strange. I mean,
100%.
doing it because they want to. I was informed that if we don't pay them enough, then they won't do it.
Exactly. Yeah, and there's a level of social prestige probably, and sort of like honor and all that stuff.
Sure.
When it comes, just like here, we kind of like look up to doctors for the most part here. Well, I guess it depends on who you ask.
Maybe not those medical clinics, those emergency ones that I have to pay $50 to breathe the same air of.
Totally. The goal of it is to provide healthcare. It's not to generate profits for insurance CEO. And you just get very different outcomes when that's the goal.
Well, it's like you said, it's a matter of political will.
Yeah, 100%. And just what it's structured to do, right? What the goal of it. And I always give the caveat that, of course, no system is perfect. There are gaps in Cuban healthcare. There are gaps in Cuban education, just like there are anywhere else. But from the get-go, the reason why it was built, right? The reason why these institutions were put together and continue to be is not to enrich an elite. It's to enrich the public, and that's what they do there.
And as I understand it, maybe you could speak a little more detailed on it. The system before this was not entirely dissimilar to what the U.S. has in its more rural regions, mainly because of like access and affordability, poverty, but also not that different from America's broader healthcare system pre-Obamacare. Not to say Obamacare is great or anything, but it was certainly worse. I
mean, it was, from my understanding, and I'm not an expert on pre-revolution Cuban healthcare, but it was more or less privatized healthcare, just like we had here. And really, pre-revolution, a lot of the things in the U.S., the way that the U.S. did them was how they did them in Cuba, because Cuba was more or less a neo-colony, an economic colony of the United States, very much like a Puerto Rico is right now. And that was the impetus of the Cuban Revolution. It wasn't necessarily a socialist or communist revolution it was really a nationalist revolution. And it was about reclaiming Cuba's sovereignty. Yeah, about reclaiming Cuba's sovereignty. At the time of the revolution, I think like 80% of the mines, 80% of Cuban industry was basically owned outright by the United States.
Well, we can't have them taking that back.
That includes energy. That includes resource extraction. You name it, and the United States had a hand in it. And that was really what spurred the revolution. And then, like, as the U.S. reacted to the revolution, Cuba sort of expropriating U.S. companies and U.S. property. And Cuba had to align itself more with the USSR and other forces, and declared itself a socialist revolution 2 years after the actual revolution happened. But it was really a nationalist revolution, more in the vein of like a Jose Marti, the other Cuban sort of like nationalist hero,
right?
Than like a, I don't know, like a Lenin type revolution.
Now these movements clearly had, like, you know, connective tissue rooted in some kind of, like, you know, a Marxist analysis. But what you're saying is that the impetus of resistance to the Batista regime was not explicitly, we need to do Cuban communism. It was, we need to emancipate ourselves from slavery, from U.S. occupation.
The coalition of forces that made up the Cuban Revolution, of course, there were communists and socialists that were fighting in the Cuban Revolution. And eventually they would be the ones that ended up with the most governing power by the end. But the coalition itself that was fighting in the revolution, I think they saw themselves more as a nationalist force, wanting to take back Cuba's like economy and sovereignty. But it was funny because when the revolution triumphed and they looked around and they're like, we don't know how to reclaim our sovereignty if we don't do socialism.
Right.
Because so much of our economy is owned by another country. And the only way to do it is to basically nationalize all of these industries and begin the process of, you know, owning them as Cuba, and not having the United States own them. And so, you know, of course, there were like natural kind of policy consequences of what they wanted to do, that ended up being, you know, what we would call like socialism or communism or whatever. But the true, you know, Fidel coming out and saying this is a socialist revolution, that didn't happen until a couple of years after the revolution actually happened. And Fidel looked around at the geopolitical situation and said, well, you know, I think it's time to align ourselves closer with the USSR, because the United States is clearly not going to be a willing partner in our development.
I think it's an interesting framework to operate from, because a lot of the hurdles that advocates for more socialization, more, you know, socialist rooted policies get caught up in the nomenclature of leftist literature, you know, very lefty academic terms. The notion that sovereignty is, you know, absent without ownership, right? Who owns this country? You know, one could look at America in a, you know, popular socialist rooted movement and see rhetoric that's, we are reclaiming sovereignty of the United States from oligarchs, from, you know, corporate overlords.
Yes, I mean, that's what public ownership of services and stuff is, right? It's a way for the public, the government, basically to reclaim the operation and the ownership of what it provides. And I think you're totally right, where, you know, we have a similar situation where our economy is definitely not collectively publicly owned in any real sense. It is set up not to benefit you and I. It is set up to provide maximum profits to a very small amount of people. So in a sense, the situation here is not that different. You know, but for Cuba, the answer was, you know, obviously armed revolution and overthrowing the government of the time, and you know, maybe that's our solution too. I don't know what the answer is.
Many people are saying. Well, now that we've kind of established a framework, tell me a little bit about the work that you're doing with, you have various organizations in your bio.
Yeah.
Give me a little perspective on what you're doing with DSA Cuba. You mentioned, or it mentions in your bio, Comrades with Kids. I'm sure that's tangentially related, but give me a little more details on what exactly your work surrounds.
I'm a DSA head. I'm a member of DSA, specifically the New York City DSA chapter. And well, just as an aside, Comrades with Kids is basically a group that's trying to organize parents. So that was something that I started a few years ago. I have various little organizing projects that I'm constantly tending to. But in terms of Cuba work, I went to Cuba. Well, I'm Cuban American. Mm-hmm. Start there. So I grew up in Miami. So everything every stereotypical experience that you think I had growing up about my family's politics toward Cuba and all of that is true. I grew up in an extremely anti-Cuban environment, or I should say anti-revolution environment, and I came to my own positions on that stuff, obviously.
Oh, I'm sure family dinner is a lot of fun.
Yeah, I mean, we just sort of it just doesn't come up. It's not.
Oh, y'all are hella American then.
we're very Americanized.
Speaking of
the thing
that
about
sentiment,
it is
if I could cut it for just a second, I have a wonderful piece of anti-Cuba propaganda in my chat right now. I'd love for you to address. I'll read it out for you.
Hey,
quote, "The healthcare in Cuban is awful," all caps. "My uncle died in a blood-stained bed in the hallway of the hospital due to blood clot that took too long to be treated. There's more doctors because the government," all caps, "dictates what career you choose. The quote-unquote doctors in Cuba would rather be tourist cab drivers because they make more money than practicing medicine. My cousin is a marine biologist because that was the best option of education that was given to her, not because she likes it. Stop praising the corruption." You stand accused. How do you plead?
It is true that cab drivers make more than Cuban doctors. That's 100% true. And yet you still have 9 point whatever doctors per citizen. If you think that the Cuban government has the capacity to dictate what each and every person's career is going to be, they have bigger fish to fry than that. I can guarantee you. And look, I'm not here to say, like I said earlier, I'm aware that the Cuban government is not a vehicle of perfect governance. But find me a country that is. And this insistence on putting a microscope on everything that Cuba does and trying to frame it as some sort of corrupt cabal, it's not my experience with Cuba. Being there, working with Cubans, organizing alongside Cubans. And yes, there are huge gaps in Cuban healthcare right now. But why? The question we have to ask after that is, why do these gaps, what is causing the gaps? I think some people, like my parents and maybe this chatter, would say, oh, it's because the Cuban government doesn't do X, Y, or Z, or hoards all the money, or does all of it, and completely ignore a huge factor, which is this country has been under blockade from the most powerful economic entity known to man for over 60 years. And there's a huge swath of implication for that. First of all, the blockade is not one thing. It's this very tangled web of executive orders and real congressional laws that were passed in the 90s, like the Helms-Burton Act, that enact all of these restrictions on Cuba, and most recently, Cuba being on what's called the State Sponsors of Terrorism list, which is the State Department list that is maintained. I think it has Syria, Iran, Iraq, and Cuba, I think, are the 4 countries that are on this list. And you might say, well, okay, so they can't trade with the United States. Why can't they trade with every other country like in the world? And that's because the United States will literally sanction other countries and other entities, even non-American ones, for doing business with Cuba. And it's happened before and will continue to happen, specifically because this country is working with a state sponsor of terror, and therefore they should be sanctioned.
I have always looked at the embargo and the refutations of successes, like we can call them what they are, successes of the Cuban system, as an indictment to the idea that their structure is bad. Like if their structure was so awful, they wouldn't survive.
If communism is doomed to fail or whatever, why do we have this blockade against an entire, like, no other country in the world? We should be absolutely clear about this. Even the ones that are our adversary, Iran, Russia, all of these places, when we sanction those countries, we sanction individuals, we sanction institutions, countries. We don't sanction an entire economy. We don't sanction an entire country, which is what we do with Cuba. It's the only country that the United States has this direct sanction policy against, and it builds up in a lot of like small ways. Like, for example, the ones I always like to cite is, if a cargo ship docks in Cuba, it cannot then dock in the United States for, I think it's 180 days or maybe it's 60 days, but a certain amount of time it cannot dock in the United States.
Yep.
So who's going to dock their ship in Cuba and deliver cargo in Cuba if it's going to mean not being able to deal with the United States for months at a time?
I think it's worth noting that any time that this has ever been brought up in a UN vote, because it is illegal. Yeah. It's one country dictating like what every country can do with another country. I'm showing an image on screen right now. When there have been votes multiple times to end the embargo, is two countries that vote against it, and somehow, that's democratic.
Yeah. And the two countries, fat air quotes, two. Yeah, they're the United States and Israel, right? So I think that I don't know, that goes a long way to explaining where the allegiances are internationally. This is like an established fact. It's not Cuban propaganda. This is something that every country in the world votes against at the UN every single year, except for like the two most genocidal countries in the world.
Yeah.
So, to foist all of the blame for the state of Cuban healthcare and other necessities, because there's straight up a humanitarian crisis going on in Cuba right now. It's extremely underreported, but there is kind of a slow motion genocide happening because people are struggling to get, like toilet paper, right? It's importing the basics, keeping up with the basics is really, really difficult in Cuba. But again, this notion that the Cuban government is willingly starving its people, the Cuban government is hoarding money, it's doing all it's
projection.
It's ridiculous is what it is, right? It's ridiculous, especially Cuba, like maybe the most solidaristic country out there. The idea that any country really would like willingly starve its own people is just babies shit, like that's not how the world works. And we should, like, if you want to talk about improving the lives of everyday Cubans, the conversation must begin at ending the US blockade, because until that happens, Cuba is stuck. They are stuck in this state of being unable to develop properly in the way that every other country, even other communist countries like Vietnam, have been allowed to develop. They are systematically being targeted and strangled, and that is like the point of the blockade, right? That's why it exists. And so nobody is here to deny, or at least I'm not, that there are serious gaps and in Cuban healthcare, and people they can't get the kind of treatment. They can barely get basic medicine like ibuprofen, right? Like one of the things we did, we're working on in DSA is getting medicine to Cuba, like basic medicine. And the reason for that is, by and large, the blockade is preventing Cuba from developing at the pace that it should be. But even still, like people are saying in your chat, like they have a vaccine for lung cancer. They have an amazing medication called Hebrapot, I think it's called B, that is for diabetic. It stops the diabetic ulcers and can prevent like the need for amputations because of that. So there's a wealth of like, even if you want to frame it from like how does it benefit the United States? Well, like we could have a very fruitful medical like exchange with the Cubans if we were to open up and be open to normalizing our relations with them. But it's just like a completely failed politics on every front, and it's just like it's not to deny that, or to purposely look away from that and just try to blame everything on like communism or a corrupt government or whatever. Like it just doesn't tell the full story. It's dishonest.
Well, also it puts aside, and you can, as an American especially, look at someone's conditions while they are, obviously in need of improvement. You can look at your own and say, well, I mean, I can get ibuprofen over the counter for relatively cheap, at least for now. I can get that. If Cubans, can't get that, well, then clearly their system must be awful. Meanwhile, we have Doctors Without Borders, like helicoptering in dentists and, general practitioners into rural mountain towns in Appalachia to provide basic medical care to people who just can't get it. And, we have 65,000 people dying every year because they can't get health care. Like, it's obfuscation. It's to distract. And the impunity of the cruelty is 100% just the American government being butthurt that they were batting 604-0 on Castro and couldn't, put down a socialist revolution in its backyard.
Yeah, that's exact. And really, like, it's really about the primary sin of extracting U.S. property.
Yep.
Like, or that was the thing that really pissed off JFK and others back in the day, and led to the very first presidential executive orders that we now know as the blockade. But yeah, that was their primary.
Well, we got on a little bit of a tangent there. Not that it wasn't great, but I had originally asked you like what your work was before we got distracted by classic State Department propaganda from Kanye's Nut Sweat in the chat. So sorry if you could kind of like back us up a second to what your work entails.
You interrupted me for Kanye's nut sweat.
I mean, he was he was doing some pretty crazy stuff in the chat, and I'm surprised he didn't say that we're not embargoing their bootstraps. So sometimes you gotta bring those up. So in terms of what we do with DSA Cuba, we go to Cuba. That's one thing. We send DSA delegations to Cuba, and we have so that people can see Cuba for themselves. Everyone who goes on one of these delegations always comes back just kind of like inspired and also shocked at what you see there. It's a very kind of like dual experience when you go to Cuba, because like you can see that there is great need there, but it's also very inspiring the way people take care of each other. They have a very solidaristic culture that's been cultivated over the years there, and that's inspiring to see. And the principles are all incredible, but obviously like the economic realities are
not where they need to be.
Right.
So yeah, we send people there. We did a big organizing campaign at the end of last year to get Biden to remove Cuba from the state sponsors of terrorism list, which he did 7 days before he left office, and which was immediately rescinded by Trump on his first day in office. So, too little, too late. That's the story of the Democrats, as we all know.
Classic.
Yeah, classic stuff. Why didn't he do it day one of his 4-year presidency? I don't know. He waited till 7 days before. So yeah, we do a lot of legislative campaigns and organizing like that. For example, right now we're keeping an eye on a bill that's called the Force Act, that would basically enshrine Cuba's status as a state sponsor of terror and making it have to be an act of Congress for that designation to be removed. Again, only Cuba. This would only apply to Cuba.
For now.
Yeah, well, they want to basically remove the president's authority to, and this is a Republican bill, which is kind of nuts, but remove the president's authority to get Cuba off of this list and have it be an act of Congress, which would make it virtually impossible to ever get Cuba removed from this list. So that's sort of the next frontier that we're looking at, the Force Act, and trying to stop that before it gets any more legs than it already has. So yeah, we do that kind of work. Yeah, and it's very, we work directly with a lot of Cubans in the media in Cuba. We work with the Cuban embassy. We try to have events for Cuban Americans. We're going to start doing a whole series of 101s about Cuba, to get people the basics of what the Cuban Revolution was, and can be, basically. So yeah, all of that stuff is stuff we do, and we hope to do more. We hope more people. My main goal with coming on here and anywhere I can talk about it is just to get people to think about Cuba in the same way that they think about Gaza.
Sure.
It's not nearly, obviously Cuba is not a bombed out shell of itself, but it is another sort of victim of US empire, right?
Sort of the last vestige of Western colonialism.
Yeah, totally. And it is having just a devastating effect on the economy. They can't keep the lights on for most on most days. So I see someone in your chat, genocide by 1,000 sanctions. Mm-hmm. That's basically what's happening, right? Many Cubans have left Cuba. I think 1% of their population fully has left in the last couple of years. So there's brain drain going on as well. It's just, they're in a spiral. And it's a spiral primarily caused by US policy. And that's something that we as Americans, I think, have kind of a duty, in the same way that we oppose the US funding Israel. We should be opposing as, loudly, the way that the U.S. Is approaching its policy.
Could you detail a little bit? Oh, did I lose you?
No, I'm here.
Okay, you froze. Oh, there it goes. Could you detail a little bit for Chad? Because we hear the term embargo, sanctions. Is there something kind of detailed that we could look as a reference point to things that are not allowed to be shipped into Cuba? Obviously, there's essentials like medicines and different parts for automotives. There's the classic, all the Americans love to go to Cuba and see all the cute classic cars, but it's that's out of necessity, not out of they're super creative and just love these cars. Happen to be dated at a specific decade of those vehicles. Is there something like concrete that we can look at where when people are advocating, they can, succinctly point to that?
Yes. A big one that has a huge effect on them is that any product, no matter where it's made, that has 10% or more US components in it is not allowed to be imported. So even if it's not made in the United States, if the chips or whatever components inside of it, even the minerals that might be used to create this product, if it's 10% or more, it cannot be brought into Cuba. And the first time you notice this is when you get on a plane to go to Cuba. The pilot will tell you, "Welcome to this Brazilian-made Embraer aircraft." It's like a legal disclaimer they have to say at the top of their flight.
They're doing an ad read.
Yeah, they're doing
crazy.
well. What they're really doing is making sure they don't get sanctioned.
Right.
Because the aircraft cannot have 10% or more U.S. components in it for it to land in Cuba. So this has a huge impact on like medical equipment. This was actually a big deal during COVID because they could not find what's the name of the machine? Like the breathing machines.
Respirator.
Yes, thank you. That were desperately needed at the time because many of them have more than 10% U.S. components. Ventilators.
Ventilators.
So that's just one rule in a web of like, the shipping rule is another one that I told you with the ships that are not able to dock in the U.S. if they've docked in Cuba. There's tons and tons of restrictions like that. I mean, what this all amounts to, especially with the state sponsors of terror, is Cuba effectively does not have credit on the international market.
It's economic apartheid.
So most of the things that they get are paid for. They have to pay in cash for them. Okay, so when you go to Havana and you look out onto the Caribbean, you will see cargo ships just docked there, waiting for cash payment before coming into the port and unloading. So again, another circumstance where I don't think any other country in the world operates without access to the global financial credit system. It's a huge hindrance on the way Cuba is able to do its day-to-day operations because they have to make a decision every day. Are we gonna provide healthcare today, or are we gonna keep the lights on?
Right.
Are we gonna bring in food today, or are we gonna bring in medicine? This is a daily choice that they're making because they have no credit, because no bank will finance.
Yeah, a choice that's foisted upon them.
Yes, right. It's not something that we're too good for they are begging for it. I mean, they're open to any avenue.
Yeah, these are not
including they've talked to me about like venture capitalists coming to Cuba and how that would be like they're in a desperate situation.
Yeah.
They don't have time for idealism really on that front. Any kind of foreign investment that they can get, they'll take it because it's like I said, it's a situation where they're deciding between medicine and food and not necessarily individuals. I'm talking about like at a policy level,
sure.
at a government level, like what do we have the cash for?
Right.
What can we bring in today? And it's just that's their daily situation. And it's like, again, like it's a miracle that they're still operating as a country at all.
I mean,
I think most other places, including maybe this one, would have like completely collapsed.
Oh, for sure.
Without access to like the global credit and banking system. You know?
I mean, I look at countries like Cuba, countries, well, not a UN recognized state, but, you know, Palestine, many others that have been under the heel, especially in this hemisphere, of US sanctions regimes. The resilience is, I think, what a lot of Western leftists look at as a bit romanticized, perhaps, but a resilience to these pressures that have been foisted upon them. There will come a time where, like, you know, it's make or break, and unfortunately, you know, it's a waiting game. But
it is, and it's something that you know, the people who are behind these policies are waiting for, right? That make or break moment. There's an entire network of anti-revolutionary operatives in Miami that are just ready to go. You know,
Republican Party's favorite Florida constituency.
Yeah, 100%. And so, yeah, there is, that's my worry, right? Is that we, you know, Cuba's at a breaking point. Something's got to give at one point. And, you know, it was great when Biden took them off the list. There was like a brief glimmer of hope, but once Trump put them on the very first day, like I was expecting, I was already planning for, okay, how are we gonna? They're definitely gonna try to put Cuba back on. How do we make it this big fight and get Cuba like in the news? And he just did it with a stroke of a pen on his very first day, within hours.
Marker.
So
with a marker.
That was gutting. Yeah.
Well, speaking of international assistance and you know, cooperation, if there are, you know, people either in your neck of the woods in America or you know, in the chat, where are some resources that we can direct them to if they, you know, want to get involved in any way, whether it's financial, whether they want to, you know, be part of these delegations, you know, where can we send them to?
Best place to go in terms of getting involved with what I do is dsaic.org/Cuba.
DSAIC.
dsaic.org/. I just threw that in the chat.
Oh, let me get you a VIP great. So you can post it. All right, I will link that as well. There we go. All right, there you are, chat.
That's sort of the landing page for our Cuba work. Get on our mailing list, and you can hear about these polyed talks. You can hear about when the delegations are happening. And there's, you know, there are a lot of other groups that are out there. There's the National Network on Cuba, that is sort of like a coalition group of many other groups that are doing Cuba work. There are people organizing aid to get out to Cuba. There's all kinds of work that is happening constantly. But really, the best thing that people can do is just to talk about Cuba, and get Cuba back on the table and back in discussions, especially in spaces like this and with audiences like what you have. Like, this is an actively, what is actually existing socialist country, right? That is 90 miles from us, is being completely obliterated by U.S. policy and held back in many ways. And it's the product of this Cold War policy that has just been jacked up and allowed to turn into this like complete monster that is choking out this island nation, right? In the middle of the Caribbean. And so like there's a lot of work to do. I hope that we can get organized and do it. And if you're not a DSA member, definitely become one. and join the Cuba Solidarity Working Group. I will personally tell me you're from Gremloe's chat, and I'll personally reach out and onboard you and get you ready.
Free pass, excellent. Now, before we wrap for the day, I do have I think an important question. A long time ago, when I was but a wee streamer, our community asked the question and did an experiment because there was a popular conversation happening on Twitch. The Cubano is a glorious creation of Cuban Americans, a delicious sandwich. And Americans love putting chips on their sandwiches. And there was a split amongst this community, broadly on Twitch. What is the preferable chip on a Cubano? A jalapeno chip or a pickle chip?
A pickle chip, I would say, because there's already pickles in it.
Thank you. It enhances it. Yes.
It enhances the pickle.